Hello, and welcome to this recording about the IVDR 3 years on since the date of application. So it's become a little bit of a tradition with me that to kind of celebrate the anniversary of the IVDR, just to do a little bit of a recap in terms of where we are and where we're going. So this is this year's version. We're doing it slightly differently this year, so this is pre-recorded. You'll find my contact details are at the end. So if you've got some specific questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to use those and contact me. So I guess we have to start with, first of all, wishing the IVDR happy birthday. So as I say, 3 years on since the date of application. And so kind of where are we now? So just as a recap, the date of application meant that all new devices and Class A non-sterile devices have to meet the IVDR in full. So any new products that have been placed on the market or these low-risk Class A non-sterile devices have to go straight to meeting the requirements of the IVDR. So this also means that all devices need to meet the post-market surveillance requirements and vigilance requirements plus registration. So this tends to be something that people are overlooking, and I know that the Dutch Competent Authority did a review last year and discovered that about 70% of manufacturers weren't currently following the post-market surveillance requirements. So it's something that is a focus, and therefore it's important to look at. And those devices which are transitioning can't make significant changes, and there is guidance in MDCG 2022-6 to help support this. Okay, so now we go another layer in. So when the latest transitions were announced, there were some caveats, and so these are described in 2024-1860. So as you will notice, some of these are highlighted in red because this is what's happening now. So there is a deadline for all devices to meet the quality management system requirements of the IVDR as described in Article 10.8. And so that date is the 26th of May, 2025, so the third birthday of the IVD regulation. So this applies to all classes of devices. So that's why it's really important to understand this. I'm going to go and talk in a little bit more detail about practically what this means in a minute. But let's also go on to the Class D devices, because you'll notice that the Class D devices must also have to use the transitional period. So this is for devices which were on the market under the directive. They must have lodged an application with the notified body by the 26th of May 2025. So if you haven't done so, you are too late. If you have done so, that application is being processed at the moment. That has to be processed successfully. So you have to have provided all the information requested and have your contract issued by the 26th of September 2025. And so then you will have until the end of December 2027 to have that application processed by the notified body and the certificate issued so that you can continue to sell that product. Now, I'm actually hearing a lot of manufacturers who may have a Class B or a C device looking at that end date, and they're not talking about the other dates, which are really critical. So if you have a Class B device, for example, don't just look at the end of December 2029 and go, oh, that's my due date. You have to have had that application accepted if it's a Class B device by the 26th of May 2027. So obviously that date is a lot closer. And that, again, you have to have the application to be of sufficient quality that it will be accepted by the 26th of September 2027. Now, why do I stress this? Is the Commission are monitoring the performance of notified bodies, but in effect also the performance of manufacturers, and still 50% of those applications are failing at that point. Because either insufficient information is provided or basic things like the intended purpose or classification is incorrect. So really look at those times. Don't just get excited about the final date. That's the date where everything needs to be completed, and you're holding a certificate in your hand so that you can continue to sell. So you need to wind back those deadlines if you haven't already done so. So in order to use the transitional period, there are additional caveats. So if you're currently complying with the IVD directive, you must continue to meet those requirements. You must not undergo significant change, and the criteria for this, as I said before, is described in MDCG 2022-6. And it also must not present an unacceptable risk to the health or safety of patients, users, or other persons, or other aspects of protection of public health. So if you've had vigilance cases, for example, you have to really carefully look at, is it still appropriate for that device to remain on the market? And then finally, manufacturers and all economic operators in the supply chain have to declare if there's going to be supply disruption. So if you're going to withdraw a product from the market, you need to make sure that the users have 6 months advance warning. So if you are the only supplier of a particular product and there is no comparable alternative, then these are the devices which are likely to fall into that category. So I said that as of 26th of May 2025, all manufacturers need to be meeting the IVDR quality management system requirements. So what I've listed here are some of the key things that I normally see go wrong. So you need to have a person responsible for regulatory compliance. So you need to have at least one. Some manufacturers will have more than one, particularly if they've got different product portfolios on more than one site. But who's the lead PRRC? What's the demarcation in the work? And that needs to be described in your quality management system. And particularly, there needs to be a letter of appointment that describes this as well. And it's often that letter that you find missing. Risk management always seems to have been a weak point for IVDs. And I think one of the confusing points is that people go, oh, I'm meeting ISO 14971, so de facto, I must meet GSPRs 1 to 8. But the devil, as I always say, is in the detail. And so these are some of the things that get missed. So benefit risk needs to be documented for each hazard. There needs to be an overall benefit risk assessment, but also for each of the individual hazards. That's often missed. It must address the severity of harm to the patient. So false positives, false negatives, delays in result, these are hazards, they're not the harm. So if you did have a false positive or negative, or there was a delay in getting that result, what harm would that cause to the patient? You need to consider also the probability that harm will occur. And ISO 14971, particularly in the annexes, talks about how you might use probabilities 1 and probabilities 2 to look at the probability of the hazard occurring versus the probability of that hazard actually, in the way it's intended to be used, causing harm to the patient. So, for example, if you always have a confirmatory test and that's part of established practice, that might impact the probability of the harm actually occurring. The next is that you need to reduce risk as low as possible, not as low as reasonably practicable as would be described in ISO 14971. So you need to be really careful with the wording and how you apply it. Risk management needs to be applied across the life cycle, and that includes post-market surveillance. I'll return to that a little bit later on. You need to have risk management plans and reports. And you need to consider hazards for known foreseeable hazards, but also consider reasonably foreseeable misuse of the device as well. You need to demonstrate that safety principles have been applied and they've been applied in order. So that's, have I designed out the risk? Have I taken protection measures? Or have warnings and precautions been applied? And this effectively means that you can't reduce probability based on labelling alone, because labelling is the weakest and the last form of risk control. It also means that the GSPRs require you to address usability risks and also address risks over the lifetime of the products. And that includes, for example, things like shipping the product to the end customer. Often what you see is that stability may have been addressed to get to the shipping hub in Europe, but actually the product has an end journey that goes on maybe to another distribution hub and then on to the customer. And do you have stability data that's actually going to cover the whole of that journey? So if we look at the conformity assessment, we talked already about those transitions, but do you have a plan for those transitions? Are you keeping it up to date? Because obviously those transitional times have changed. And are you discussing that at management review? Management review requires that you discuss any significant changes to regulation, and this is a significant change. And are you going to meet those transitional milestones as we've just discussed? And are those considered at management review? So we talked about there's no transitions for new devices. Clinical performance studies are expected for new devices. So you need to make sure that you've got procedures in place. You may have not used them yet, but what is your process going to be for doing those clinical performance studies? And also, I often see that manufacturers aren't talking about ISO 29116, which is how you would conduct those studies. So that needs to be visible in your quality management system. Now, I know standards are there to support you and therefore are not mandatory. However, ISO 29116 is one of those standards that is actually mentioned within the regulation, and so it is an expectation. So it really does need to be mentioned within the quality management system. And as I say, many manufacturers, because they're still dealing with legacy devices, have not got those procedures actually in their system at the moment. So also consider change control. So if you make a change to the product, you're going through your change control process. Does that trigger a significant change to the product, which is going to mean that you can no longer use a transition? So again, the MDCG 2022-6 is going to help you determine whether actually you can still consider to continue to sell that product using the transitional arrangement. But also bear in mind that the rules are slightly different if you've got a significant change to a product that is now under the IVDR. What do you need to tell the notified body about? So if you have a technical documentation certificate, there could be changes that affect the safety and performance of the device, or the conditions prescribed for its use. So in other words, its intended use. If those change, you do have to make sure you tell the notified body, and you will need definitions within your own processes that describe how you consider that impacts you and your products. Now, obviously, Class C or many Class B and C devices may have a quality management system certificate that's looking at substantial change to the quality management system or the range of devices which have been covered. So again, you will need to have a different set of criteria for those. And again, as we've just talked about, don't forget that if you're withdrawing a product, that could also trigger you having to notify a disruption of supply to the supply chain. So a good place to make sure that's not forgotten is having a trigger within your change control process. So we talked a little bit about post-market surveillance already. So do you have post-market surveillance procedures, processes? Do you have PMPF plans? Bearing in mind the PMPF plan is one of those things that the notified body is going to ask you for right back at the point of application. And have you updated your vigilance procedures to make sure that the new reporting times, for example, have been addressed? And finally, internal audits are important. So, internal audits is a way of checking that all these things have actually been implemented. Now, having been an internal auditor in the past myself, often what you would find is that people would say, "Oh, but I'm following my procedures." And as an internal auditor, you would have to say, "Yes, I can understand you're following your procedures, but your procedures have gaps, you're missing things." So, one of the things with internal audits is making sure that you are ensuring that your procedures have closed those gaps, and that also that they are being implemented. So this also means that the people performing those audits also needs to have been trained in the IVD regulation. And there are different ways of doing this, implementing this. So some manufacturers will say, I cover the IVDR in every single internal audit I have, which means that all your internal auditors need to be trained to the IVDR. Alternatively, some manufacturers will say, I actually have one IVDR focused audit a year that will particularly look at those requirements. It's up to you which way you do it. If you're looking at market access to other countries like Health Canada, for example, you often have to do the same sort of choice there. So this isn't unique to the IVDR. You always need to make sure that your auditors are appropriately trained and kept up to date as well. So talking of keeping up to date, don't forget the notified bodies are going to sample those C and B devices. That's with the exception of those which have a technical documentation certificate, so something like a near patient test, for example, or a Class D. So they will expect that the technical files remain up to date. So that's with the latest changes to standards and guidance. And that catches a lot of manufacturers out, particularly kind of the first time around the block. So standards and guidance aren't mandatory. However, they do explain best practice. And once you start to put some of those into things like your GSPR checklists, so for example, in our sector, things like the CLS guidance documents, they're not harmonized standards. On the other hand, they do describe best practice. So you've now put that in your GSPR checklist because they're globally recognized as best practice. If they change, you would be expected to understand what that change is. Does that change impact your device? Do the changes that have been made to the standard or guidance address a risk? And if they have, then does that mean that your device remains state of the art, or is there something you need to do to close the gap to the guidance document so that you can actually now claim full compliance? So these are the things that it means that even though you may have a certificate to the IVDR, you've still actually got quite a lot of work to do to identify all these changes that are going on. There are tools out there that can help you do this, but then you need to do a gap assessment, and then you need to figure out how you're actually going to implement changes and if they're necessary. So that's quite a lot more work than maybe you've been doing under the IVD directive. So even some of those guidance documents that were issued some time ago are changing. So the example I've got here is the IVDR classification. So we're now on revision 4. So if you did your classification some time ago when you started implementation, then you need to go back and just make sure that you haven't missed anything. And so last year there was an update, Rev 3, that provided a definition of a kit because that wasn't defined anywhere in the regulation. And this year in March, we also had revision 4, and that declassified or reduced the classification of COVID. So self-tests went from being a class D to a class C, and the professional uses went from a D to a B. And that reflected the the fact that we're no longer in a pandemic situation with COVID. So another guidance document that came out at the back end of last year that I've highlighted here is the guidance document MDCG 2024-11. What this addresses is borderline issues with general laboratory use and research use only devices. So it replaces a MedDev document, and in some cases, it actually uses similar examples that were in that MedDev document. Seeing a lot of devices which are now being declared to be research use only, as opposed to but having clinical claims. This document talks about that, what you can and you can't do. So if a device is for research use only, then you can't sell it with clinical claims. And this document helps look at that and describes what you can and you can't say. So it's an important document to look at. So a little bit of a recap over the key findings from notified bodies. The key ones tend to still be on clinical performance, particularly because mainly at the moment we're still dealing with legacy devices where that clinical performance may have been performed some time ago. I'm going to come back to that a little bit more in the next slide. Labeling is always such a detailed thing. You know, you do have to tick and tie every single requirement that's in the regulation against what you've got in your instructions for use. And obviously this has a huge knock-on effect when it comes to things like rest of world labeling, if you're going to have to start changing your instructions for use, for example. We talked about risk management. As I say, it is a weak point. Stability is definitely another weak point. One point that I would identify, I did say that many manufacturers are using things like the CLSI guidance documents. In some cases, when it comes to stability, it gives you a little bit more leeway than the regulation does. The regulation says you should have done 3 batches. So if you have a discussion with your notified body about how many batches are required, and you say you're following the CLSI guidance documents, and they say, no, you need 3 batches, this might be the reason why. So analytical performance, again, how that's described. Again, I'm going to come back and talk about that as part of the clinical performance in a minute, and I will come back and talk about post-market surveillance. So the final one we've got here is the manufacturer's information. So this seems to be something that people really don't want to describe in detail or don't really understand what the notified body is looking for. The notified body needs to, when they're starting to read your file, understand how your manufacturing process works, so process flows are good, and also if manufacturing takes place at multiple different sites, they need to understand that because they'll also then want to look at the certificates you provide and make sure that there's appropriate 13485 cover across each of those sites and how you're actually managing perhaps sister sites which could be suppliers to you. So it isn't brain surgery, but that's you need to tell the story so that they can understand what the manufacturing process is and where it takes place. And again, things like process flows really help tell that story in the minimal number of words. So I'm just briefly going to come back to the clinical performance. As I say, it's still giving rise to an awful lot of non-conformities. As we're still getting through the bolus of legacy devices, I'm just going to pick up one particular point here, which is Annex 13 1.2.3. And this says that you need to demonstrate clinical performance of the device, and you have to have one of these 3 bullet points. So it's clinical performance studies, which most manufacturers, unless it's a new device, don't have because you can't follow all the requirements of the clinical performance studies because things like Unimed wasn't in existence if it's an older device. Scientific peer-reviewed literature, and that has to be on the device in question, not on competitors' devices, and it needs to be on data that is relevant to the device that you're wanting to get approved, or it needs to be published experience gained by routine diagnostic testing, and often things like quality assurance schemes is the sort of data that would be accepted for this. So you've got to have some data on one of those bullet points. Then you can go on and have clinical performance studies that may have been other sources of data, perhaps something that you've done as part of a study for FDA or for TGA, Health Canada, etc. So that's where you suck in those other sources of data. But they're wanting to see how you've met one of the first three bullet points first. And as I say, they are really looking to see those clinical performance studies have been performed for new devices. Now, does that mean you've always got to do a clinical performance study in Europe? Not necessarily. So, for example, if you were doing a study outside of Europe, make sure that you've looked at all the bullet points in Annex 13 and, if appropriate, Annex 14, and you can demonstrate how you've met each of those or done something equivalent. Or if you've not followed it, it wasn't appropriate. So, for example, you will not have a UDAMED number for the clinical performance study because you didn't perform it in Europe. So you need to justify why you didn't have that. On the other hand, you will have appropriate ethics committee approvals and that sort of thing. So you need to pretty much do a table with a gap assessment in that describes how you are doing something that's equivalent to the European requirements. So I often use this diagram, and it's because this is often where we're seeing non-conformances. Sometimes it's because the information that has been provided in a legacy technical file isn't consistent. So perhaps you've done your analytical and clinical performance studies for the device, and the device is an old device, but you've had to update the intended purpose to meet the requirements of the IVD regulation. So it's not always clear how that intended purpose data matches to the information that you've got in your analytical and clinical performance reports, and you need to describe that. Things like the performance evaluation plan often don't clearly describe what methods you're using. People don't often understand that the methods may be that you're pointing to a standard. It could be that you're pointing to guidance. It could be that you're pointing to things like CLSI guidance. So make sure it's clear what methods you're applying. And then ultimately, you also need to make sure that it's quite clear that your device is state of the art. So again, all these things are connected. And so never forget that the output of your clinical performance study is are there any unanswered questions? And these are the unanswered questions that you need to be monitoring as part of post-market surveillance, and particularly if it's a novel device or you have perhaps insufficient, or you have not as much data as you would like, perhaps is a better way of saying it, than insufficient data on perhaps a particular population, perhaps pediatrics, for example. You've got some data, but it would be better to have more data. And then that would be the sort of question that you would be addressing as part of your post-market performance follow-up. So this also helps you determine what sort of information am I interrogating the information that I'm collecting as part of my post-market surveillance. And if it's a legacy device, it's got existing performance, you don't feel you actually need to be doing prospective post-market performance follow-up studies, then what would trigger a post-market performance follow-up study? This might be because perhaps new hazards have been identified as part of your post-market surveillance, and that would then trigger you to do a study to determine whether it impacts your product. whilst this happened a few years ago, the fact that people that go to the gym often take high levels of biotin, and would that impact a assay that was using biotin streptavidin conjugates? That would be kind of an example of something that was a hazard that would have been identified after the product was on the market, and would require some post-market performance follow-up activity to investigate whether that hazard was actually going to impact your device or not, which you would then feed back into your risk management. So all these different parts of the technical documentation are connected. And for example, the other thing is that came high on the list of notified body findings is things like labeling. So for example, if you've identified in your performance evaluation plan that you have a list of interfering substances, but actually you have a different list in your instructions for use, those don't marry up. Everything does need to tick and tie. It might be that you have a shorter list in your instructions for use because as part of the testing you did in the performance evaluation, you determined that some of them were negligible. However, you shouldn't have a longer list of potential hazards in your instructions for use and a shorter list in the performance evaluation plan. So the whole thing needs to marry together. And finally, if you're getting questions back from the notified body and you think, well, I've got good data here, what's the problem? Then the problem might be you're just not telling a good story. So as I say, it's that flow between what's in your performance evaluation plan. You clearly describe how the performance of the device will be confirmed. So what are the methods? How that relates to standards and guidance, and how that also relates to being state of the art. And will the device be used in combination, or is it going to be used as a standalone device, for example? Then, as part of the performance evaluation report, they are wanting to see separate reports for scientific validity, analytical and clinical performance, as well as separate performance evaluation plans and reports. This might seem like there's a lot of duplication. We're seeing more and more manufacturers looking at using automation so that they can consistently have paragraphs which are repeated in each of these plans. Sometimes these reports do have to be standalone. Sometimes they are split up and looked at by different reviewers within the notified body, and it is what the regulation says. So if the regulation says there is a plan and it has to have these bullet points in it, you have to have a plan with those bullet points in it. So unfortunately, you don't have the flexibility to do it a different way. And always make sure you've got clear conclusions. So if you've got analytical performance reports and the sections are using data that you've got from previous studies, then does the evidence that you have demonstrate that a claim has been met? And ultimately, what they're looking for is the conclusions that show that your device is state of the art in medicine, that the benefit risk is also in the patient's favour. So those are the conclusions that you're wanting to see coming out of these reports. So finally, let's just take a quick glimpse into the future. So currently notified bodies have capacity, but this could change the closer we get to deadlines. So don't take it for granted, but take advantage. So focus on providing faster notified bodies with sufficient time to make sure that you clear the systems and each of those deadlines have been met. So at the moment, we're seeing between 6 months to 2 years. I think people are still saying, to be safe, on average, 18 months to get through the notified bodies. But I have seen even startup companies get through within 6 months, certainly to getting their technical questions addressed. So we are seeing improvement. So don't use this as an excuse not to get moving. I know I always say don't take your foot off the gas, but yeah, don't take your foot off the gas. So the gears of the IVDR are slowly turning, but manufacturers need to improve their first pass acceptance. Still, people going to the notified body for the first time, 50% are not getting through first time. There's information that's missing. So again, get experience with the notified body as soon as you can so that you always then provide them in future with the information that they need. Manufacturers also need to improve their response time to questions. If you look at that 18 months on average, 50% of that time, so 9 months of that time is sitting with the manufacturer and 9 months of the time is sitting with the notified body. So everybody can do something to speed things up. And don't forget, if it's sitting with the notified body, it's costing you money. So notified bodies can also improve the clarity of the application process and expectations, and they are working on doing that. And as Team NB working on improving that, and also providing cost-effective training on what that should look like. And notified bodies also need to improve the review time for certificate release. Now, I said before, I have seen manufacturers, even startups, who get to the point at which they have their technical questions addressed. However, we are seeing up to 6 months for that certificate to actually being released. Now, the reason for this is that the technical reviewer is recommending certification. So it's a little bit like you manufacturing a device, but now it still needs to go through the final QC and QA process in your company before it can be released. And so that's what this extra time takes. But make sure you talk to your notified body, because you will need to upward manage within your organization that, yes, it's good news that we've got no more questions. It looks like we've got a positive recommendation from the technical reviewer. However, it doesn't mean you're going to have the certificate in your hot little hands within the next 24 hours. It's not going to happen. So it's important for changes to labeling and things like that, the internal processes that you're going to have to do within your company to change your inventory over, then it gives you confidence that you can go ahead and start doing that. Finally, don't forget sampling. So this requires resource, because you will have to provide files to the notified body. You also have to keep those files up to date. And also make sure you're budgeting for it. So every time you have an interaction with a notified body, it's going to cost you money. And that can be a bit of a surprise to some manufacturers. It's also something that you've not done before. And so therefore, it's difficult to figure out what that should look like. So again, make sure you've got some contingency in your budget that will address that. So the future, you will have probably heard that, the Commission is looking at what should the future for medical device and IVD regulations look like. Does the system need to change? How can they learn from what's happened so far and the delays that we've seen? You need to track the changes, but don't assume that that's just going to automatically mean another extension. You could really have a problem if you make that assumption. The reason for that is that many of the large manufacturers are nearing completion for their transitions. So unless you've got a product which you could argue there is no equivalent product on the market and that you could have an emergency use authorization, you won't be on the market. And if you do have an emergency use authorization, then the competent authority is only going to ask for the same information that the notified body has. So it would have to be a delay at the notified body's end rather than at your end. So you need to have that technical documentation put together either way. The changes that are likely to come will be driving the consistency between notified bodies and also things like the administrative process as well. For example, clinical performance studies at the moment, you have to go and ask permission from each of the member states where you're running those studies. And so that creates quite a lot of burden. So don't assume that there's just going to be automatic extensions to those final transition periods. That would be quite a dangerous thing to do. So, as I mentioned before, this is a recording rather than an interactive session. So these are my contact details. Please feel free to get in touch or just to comment to let us know that you found this webinar useful. We will be looking to provide further content as we move forwards. So thank you very much. And as I say, I hope you found this useful.